The gunshot that shattered the window of the mercantile store sent glass cascading across Adelaide Harper's boots like frozen rain. And she knew in that instant her father was dead before she even heard his body hit the floor. The spring of 1878 had brought nothing but death to Durango, Colorado. First her mother to fever, and now her father to a bullet meant for the marshal who had ducked at precisely the right moment. Adelaide stood frozen among the bolts of fabric she had been organizing, watching crimson spread across the rough wooden planks while the shooter's horse thundered away down the dusty main street. The marshal was shouting something. People were running, but all Adelaide could hear was the terrible silence where her father's heartbeat should have been. She did not cry at the funeral. She stood in her black dress that had been her mother's mourning clothes just 2 months prior, and she stared at the simple pine coffin while Reverend Matthews spoke words that meant nothing. Her father had been 49 years old, a merchant who had never harmed anyone, who had sold dry goods and farming supplies and penny candy to children. He had been all she had left in this world, and now she was 21 years old and utterly alone. The townspeople offered their condolences with awkward pats on her shoulder and promises of prayers, but prayers would not pay the mortgage on the store, and prayers would not fill the emptiness that had opened up inside her chest like a canyon. The bank manager came 3 days later. Mr. Winters was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the apologetic expression of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had worn grooves into his face. He sat in the small office behind the store and explained in patient detail that her father had taken out a significant loan to expand the business 6 months ago, and that loan was now due. The store itself was collateral. Adelaide had 30 days to pay the full amount, or the bank would take possession of the property and everything in it. How much? Adelaide asked, though she already knew from the way Mr. Winters would not quite meet her eyes that the number would be impossible. $3,000, he said quietly. She had $217 in the strongbox upstairs, money from recent sales that had not yet been deposited. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. The store her father had built over 20 years, the home she had grown up in, the only solid thing left in her crumbling world was about to be taken from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Adelaide spent that night going through her father's papers, searching desperately for some solution she knew did not exist. She found letters from suppliers, receipts, a journal where he had noted every transaction with meticulous care. She found a photograph of her mother on their wedding day, young and smiling. She found her own baby shoes wrapped in tissue paper. She did not find $3,000 or any way to acquire it. The next morning she rose before dawn and did what she had always done. She opened the store. She swept the floor where her father had died, though someone had already cleaned the blood. She arranged the shelves and she waited for customers, because she did not know what else to do. If she had only 30 days left in this place, she would not spend them weeping. The cowboy walked in around mid-morning, trailing dust and the smell of horse and leather. Adelaide looked up from the ledger she had been pretending to balance and saw a man perhaps 3 or 4 years older than herself, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He was tall and rangy in the way of men who spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground, and he removed his hat when he entered, which was more courtesy than many showed. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice rough as though he had not spoken in days. "I need supplies. Flour, beans, coffee, salt, ammunition for a Winchester." Adelaide nodded and began gathering the items, moving through the familiar routine with automatic precision. The cowboy wandered the store while she worked. examining tools and rope and various implements with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of quality equipment. When she had everything assembled on the counter, he counted out payment in coins and crumpled bills, his hands scarred and calloused. "You are Adelaide Harper," he said, and it was not quite a question. She looked at him sharply. "You knew my father?" "No, madam, but I heard what happened." "I am sorry for your loss." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "I also heard the bank is taking the store." Adelaide felt her spine stiffen. So the whole town was talking about her impending ruin. Of course they were. Durango was not large enough for secrets. "That is not your concern," she said, her voice flat. "No, madam, I suppose it is not." But he did not move to leave. Instead, he stood there, hat in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "My name is Thomas Keller. I work a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. Been trying to build it up for the past 3 years. That is very interesting, Mr. Keller, but I have work to do." Adelaide knew she sounded harsh, but she could not bear sympathy from strangers. She was holding herself together with will alone, and any kindness might shatter her completely. Thomas Keller nodded slowly. "Yes, madam, I will get out of your way." He gathered his supplies and headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "If you need anything, Miss Harper, my ranch is the one with the stone chimney North Road past the Miller farm. Anyone can tell you how to find it." Then he was gone, and Adelaide was alone again with her ledgers and her 30 days and her steadily crumbling world. The days passed like water through her fingers. Adelaide tried everything she could think of to raise the money. She sold her mother's jewelry, which brought in $50. She sold every item in the store she could possibly part with at reduced prices to generate quick cash. She wrote to her father's brother and sent Louis, but the letter would take weeks to arrive, and she knew her uncle had his own family to support. By the time 2 weeks had passed, she had scraped together $943, and she knew it was not enough. It would never be enough. She was closing the store one evening, pulling the shades and locking the door, when she saw Thomas Keller's horse tied outside. He was sitting on the bench in front of the building, his hat tipped back, watching the sun set over the San Juan Mountains in the distance. The light turned everything gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent. "Mr. Keller," Adelaide said carefully, "may I help you with something?" He stood, and in the fading light his face was all plains and shadows. "I have been thinking, Miss Harper, about your situation. I do not need charity." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I am not offering charity. I am offering a business arrangement." He took a breath, and Adelaide realized he was nervous, though he was trying to hide it. "You need money." "I need someone who knows how to run a store and keep books and manage a business. My ranch is good land, but I am barely keeping it going because I spend all my time working cattle and mending fences and breaking horses. I have no time to manage supplies or finances or any of the practical matters that keep a ranch running properly." Adelaide stared at him. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Keller?" "Marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. You would bring your business skills and what money you have saved. I would provide a home and security and the ranch. Together we could build something that would support both of us. You would not have to worry about the bank taking your home, and I would have helped building a real, sustainable operation." She could not quite process what she was hearing. "You want to marry me so I can keep your books?" "I want to marry you because you are clearly smart and capable, and you deserve better than watching your life be taken apart by bankers who do not care," Thomas said, his voice low and intense. "And because I think together we could make something good, something worth having. I am not asking you to love me, Miss Harper. I am asking you to take a chance on building a future that does not involve losing everything your family worked for." Adelaide looked at this cowboy she had met exactly once before today, this stranger who was offering her a lifeline in the form of a business arrangement. It was utterly insane. She knew nothing about him except that he apparently owned a ranch and needed help managing it. He could be cruel or drunk or any number of terrible things. But when she tried to think of alternatives, all she saw was the bank taking the store, and herself with nowhere to go and no way to survive in a world that did not look kindly on women alone. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course. You have 2 weeks left before the bank takes possession, is that right?" When she nodded, he continued, "I will come back in 3 days for your answer. That should give you time to consider properly." He tipped his hat to her and rode away, leaving Adelaide standing in the gathering darkness with her mind spinning like a dust devil. She could not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed she had slept in since childhood and tried to imagine what her life might look like as Thomas Keller's wife. She knew nothing about ranching, nothing about living miles from town, nothing about this man except that he had kind eyes and a straightforward manner. But she also knew that her other options were vanishing like water in desert sand. She could try to find work in Durango, perhaps as a seamstress or a servant, but those positions were few and poorly paid. She could attempt to travel to St. Louis to throw herself on her uncle's mercy. She could try to find another man to marry, but she had no time to court and no prospects who had shown interest. Thomas Keller was offering her a way to not lose everything. It was pragmatic and businesslike, and nothing like the romantic dreams she had harbored as a girl, but those dreams had died along with her parents. What remained was survival, and survival meant making hard choices. When Thomas returned 3 days later, Adelaide was waiting for him. She had spent the intervening time gathering information about him from townspeople, and what she learned was reassuring. He was known as honest and hardworking, if quiet and solitary. He had bought his ranch 3 years ago and had been working it alone since then. He paid his debts and did not drink to excess. He had a reputation for being good with horses. No one had anything particularly bad to say about him, which in a small town was almost remarkable. "I will marry you," Adelaide said without preamble when he walked into the store, "but I have conditions." Thomas nodded, his face carefully neutral. "I would expect nothing less. I want this to be a real partnership. I will help you build your ranch and manage the business side of the operation, but I expect to be consulted on major decisions. I am not looking to be a servant or a decoration. I want to contribute and be valued for that contribution." "Agreed." "I want time before anything of a physical nature is expected between us. We are strangers. I need time to know you before I can be a wife in that sense." Adelaide felt her cheeks heat, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. This was too important to be shy about. Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Miss Harper, I would never force myself on you or expect anything you were not willing to give. We can take whatever time you need. I am not looking for a whore. I am looking for a partner." The bluntness of his language should have shocked her, but instead Adelaide felt a strange relief. He was being honest, which she could respect. "Then we have an agreement. How do you propose we proceed?" "I will go to the bank tomorrow and pay off your father's loan. We can be married by the end of the week, and you can move your belongings to the ranch. As for the store, we can keep it running if you want. Hire someone to manage it day to day. It could provide additional income and a connection to town." Adelaide felt something unknot in her chest that had been tight since the day her father died. She would not lose the store. She would not be destitute and alone. She was choosing a strange path, but it was a path forward, and that was more than she had thought possible a few days ago. "There is one more thing," she said quietly. "I do not know anything about ranching. I am going to make mistakes. I need you to be patient with me while I learn." For the first time, Thomas smiled, and it transformed his entire face from grim and weathered to something warmer. "Miss Harper, I am going to make mistakes too. I have never had a partner before. I reckon we will both be learning as we go." They were married in the Durango church on a Saturday morning with only Reverend Matthews and his wife as witnesses. Adelaide wore her mother's best dress, altered to fit her frame. Thomas wore a clean shirt and vest and looked uncomfortable in the formal setting. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, which seemed appropriate for a marriage that was fundamentally a practical arrangement. When Reverend Matthews told Thomas he could kiss his bride, Thomas looked at Adelaide with a question in his eyes, and she nodded slightly. His kiss was chaste and gentle, barely more than a brush of lips, but something in Adelaide's stomach fluttered strangely at the contact. They rode to the ranch that afternoon with Adelaide's belongings packed in a wagon Thomas had borrowed from a neighbor. The journey took them north through rolling hills studded with juniper and pinyon pine, the San Juan Mountains rising dramatic and snow capped in the distance. The April air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and new grass. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of riding beside a man who was now her husband but remained essentially a stranger, Adelaide felt something tentatively unfurl inside her that might have been hope. The ranch was smaller than she had expected, but well maintained. The house was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs with that promised stone chimney, a covered porch, and 2 glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a corral with several horses, and fields that had been cleared for planting. Everything spoke of hard work and determination, one man fighting to carve a home out of wild land. "It is not much yet," Thomas said, helping her down from the wagon, "but it has good water and the grazing is decent. I have been building slowly, trying to do things right rather than fast." "It is yours," Adelaide said. "That counts for something." He showed her through the house, which was sparse but clean. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, a small bedroom, and a loft space accessible by a ladder. The furniture was rough but serviceable, clearly handmade. It was the home of a bachelor who had focused on function over comfort, but Adelaide could see potential in the bones of it. "You can have the bedroom," Thomas said. "I will sleep in the loft. That way you will have your privacy." Adelaide had been bracing herself for an awkward discussion about sleeping arrangements, and his matter-of-fact solution brought a rush of relief and something else, something that might have been gratitude or possibly the beginning of trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. They spent the rest of that first day unloading her belongings and figuring out where things would go. Adelaide had brought clothes, books, kitchen items, her mother's wedding quilt, and the photograph of her parents. Thomas made space for everything without complaint, moving his own possessions to accommodate hers. By the time darkness fell, the house looked more lived in, more like a home that belonged to 2 people rather than one lonely man. Dinner was simple, beans and cornbread that Thomas prepared with the efficiency of long practice. They ate at the rough wooden table, and the silence between them was not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I should tell you what needs to be done around here, so you can decide how you want to help," he said. "I've got 30 head of cattle right now, hoping to expand to 60 by next year. I breed horses, which brings in good money when I can sell them. I am trying to plant hay to reduce feed costs through the winter. The chickens provide eggs we can sell in town. The biggest problems are managing the money side of things, knowing when to buy and sell, and keeping track of what supplies we need before we run out." Adelaide nodded, her mind already working through the practical aspects. I can set up a proper bookkeeping system. I can also handle trips into town for supplies and selling eggs and anything else we produce. If we keep the store running, I can coordinate between the two operations, maybe use the ranch to supply some items for the store. That is smart thinking. Thomas looked at her with something like respect. I knew you would be good at this. You did not know any such thing, Adelaide said, but she was almost smiling. You took a chance on a desperate woman who might have been completely useless. You are not useless. His voice was firm. And you were not desperate, you were fighting. There is a difference. Something warm kindled in Adelaide's chest at his words. She had felt desperate, felt helpless, but he saw her differently. He saw her as someone who fought, who had strength. It was a gift she had not known she needed. The first weeks of marriage were an education in compromise and patience. Adelaide learned the rhythm of ranch life, rising before dawn to gather eggs and help with morning chores. Thomas taught her about the cattle, how to spot illness or injury, how to manage grazing patterns. She taught him about proper record keeping and financial planning, showing him how tracking every expense and income could reveal patterns and opportunities. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, and slowly the strangeness between them began to ease. Adelaide found that she liked the physical work, the way her body grew stronger and more capable. She liked the satisfaction of seeing tangible results from her efforts, eggs in the basket and neat columns of numbers in the ledger. She liked the landscape, the big sky and the mountains and the wind that never stopped blowing. Most surprisingly, she found that she liked Thomas. He was a quiet man, but not cold. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly, and he listened when she talked, really listened, considering her words seriously. He was patient with her ignorance about ranching and respectful of her knowledge about business. He did not expect her to cook elaborate meals or maintain a spotless house, understanding that they were both working full days and needed to share the domestic labor. He kept his promise about giving her space and time, sleeping in the loft, and never pushing for more than she was ready to give. One evening about 6 weeks after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The day had been long and hot, and they were both dusty and tired. Adelaide had spent the afternoon mending fence while Thomas worked with a young horse in the corral. Her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, but she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her old life in town. "You regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Marrying me, leaving the store, coming out here?" Adelaide considered the question honestly. She missed her father with an ache that had not diminished. She missed the familiar rhythms of town life sometimes. But when she thought about where she would be if she had not made this choice, about the emptiness and loss and slow slide into poverty, she knew the answer. "No," she said. "I do not regret it, do you?" "Not for a minute." He was looking at the mountains, his profile sharp against the fading light. "You have made this place feel different, better, more like a home and less like just a piece of land I am fighting to keep." "We are fighting to keep it," Adelaide corrected gently. "That was the agreement. Partners." He turned to look at her then, and something in his creek water eyes made her breath catch. "Partners," he agreed softly. The moment stretched between them, full of things unsaid, and Adelaide felt something shift in her chest, some barrier beginning to crack. She had married this man for practical reasons, for survival, but she was starting to realize that practicality and affection were not mutually exclusive. She was starting to care about Thomas Keller, about his quiet strength and his careful kindness. She was starting to want this to be more than just a business arrangement, but old fears and fresh grief kept her silent, and the moment passed. Thomas stood and stretched, breaking the spell. "I should check on the horses before full dark," he said, and Adelaide nodded, not trusting her voice. Summer deepened over the ranch, bringing long days of relentless sun and afternoon thunderstorms that turned the sky purple and lit the mountains with lightning. The cattle grew fat on good grass, and Thomas sold 3 trained horses for prices that made Adelaide's careful bookkeeping show a healthy profit. They hired a young man named Ben to manage the store in town, which freed Adelaide to focus on the ranch while still maintaining an income stream from the mercantile business. Adelaide and Thomas fell into an easy partnership, their initial awkwardness fading into comfortable familiarity. They developed routines and private jokes. They learned each other's moods and habits. Thomas discovered that Adelaide sang while she worked, old hymns and folk songs from her childhood. Adelaide learned that Thomas could draw beautifully, sketching horses and landscapes with surprising skill. They were building a life together, piece by careful piece. But underneath the daily routine, tension was growing. Adelaide found herself watching Thomas when he worked, admiring the strength in his arms and the way he moved with unconscious grace. She noticed things she had not let herself notice before: the rare smile that transformed his face, the gentleness of his hands with the animals, the way he always made sure she ate enough at meals. She caught him watching her sometimes too, his gaze warm and considering, and those moments made her pulse race. They were married but not truly husband and wife, partners but not lovers, and the space between what they were and what they might become felt increasingly impossible to bridge. Adelaide did not know how to cross that distance, did not know how to tell Thomas that she was ready for more without feeling exposed and vulnerable. The decision was taken out of her hands on an August evening when a summer storm rolled through with unusual violence. Lightning struck the barn, and suddenly there was fire licking up the old dry wood, flames spreading with terrifying speed. Thomas was already running before Adelaide fully registered what was happening, shouting for her to open the corral gates and free the horses. The next hour was chaos and smoke and desperate effort. They got the horses out and managed to save most of the tack and equipment, but the barn itself was lost, collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks and embers. They stood in the rain watching it burn, soaked and exhausted and grateful that nothing living had been trapped inside. When it was finally over, when the rain had reduced the fire to smoking ruins, and dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky, they walked back to the house in silence. Adelaide was shaking, delayed shock setting in now that the emergency had passed. Thomas guided her inside and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his hands gentle. "We lost the barn," Adelaide whispered, staring at nothing. The barn that Thomas had built with his own hands, that represented years of work and investment, the barn that was essential to the ranch's operation. "We are alive," Thomas said firmly. "The horses are safe. Everything else can be rebuilt. It will cost so much money." We were finally getting ahead, and now this. Adelaide felt tears starting, all the fear and exhaustion of the night overwhelming her defenses. "Then we will rebuild," Thomas said, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away tears. "Adelaide, listen to me. We will figure it out. That is what partners do." She looked into his eyes, at the smoke-smudged face and the absolute certainty in his expression, and something inside her finally broke open. "I do not want to just be partners anymore," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Thomas, I care about you. I think I might be falling in love with you, and I do not know when it happened, but it did. And I am tired of pretending that this is just a business arrangement." For a long moment, Thomas just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he smiled, that rare transformative smile, and he was kissing her. Not the chaste brush of lips from their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and searching and full of months of restrained wanting. Adelaide kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pouring everything she had been too afraid to say into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I have been half in love with you since the day I first walked into your father's store," he said roughly. "I have been completely in love with you since about a week after we married. I have been waiting for you to be ready, and God, Adelaide, I am so glad you are ready." She laughed, shaky and relieved and absurdly happy despite the smoking ruins outside and the financial disaster looming over them. "We have terrible timing." "We have perfect timing," he corrected, kissing her again. "Everything is going to be fine. Better than fine." They made love as the sun rose, finally consummating the marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement and had transformed into something real and deep. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Adelaide felt a peace she had not known since before her mother got sick. She had lost so much, her parents and her childhood home and the life she had expected to live. But she had found something too, something she had not even known to look for. She had found partnership and purpose and love with a quiet cowboy who saw her as an equal. The barn fire proved to be both a disaster and an opportunity. They had insurance money, though not enough to cover the full cost of rebuilding. But as word spread through the community about what had happened, neighbors began showing up to help. Men came to clear the rubble and raise a new barn, a proper one with good lumber and a stone foundation. Women brought food and supplies. Thomas's honesty and Adelaide's father's good reputation in town meant that people were willing to extend credit and offer assistance. Adelaide threw herself into the rebuilding effort with fierce determination. She negotiated with suppliers, coordinated the work crews, managed the finances with careful precision. Thomas worked alongside the other men, his knowledge of construction guiding the process. They worked from dawn until after dark for weeks, exhausted and sore but united in purpose. The new barn went up stronger and larger than the old one, with proper ventilation and a loft for hay storage. When it was finished, they held a barn dance to thank everyone who had helped, clearing out the space and bringing in musicians. Adelaide danced with Thomas under the lantern light, her head on his shoulder, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for this community and this life and this man who had offered her a future when she thought she had none. "We did it," Thomas murmured against her hair. "We built something new." Adelaide remembered those words a few months later when she realized she was pregnant. The morning sickness started in October, and at first she thought it was just a stomach ailment. But when it persisted for weeks and her monthly courses stopped, the truth became undeniable. She was carrying Thomas's child. She told him on a cold evening in November, the first snow of the season dusting the mountains. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, and Adelaide had been working up her courage for hours. Finally, she just said it, straight and simple. "Thomas, I am going to have a baby." He went very still, his eyes wide. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor confirming it, yes. I think I am about 3 months along. The baby should come in late May or early June." Thomas's face went through a series of expressions too quick to name before settling on something like awe. "We are going to have a child," he said, as though testing the words. Then he was moving, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight. "Adelaide, that is wonderful. That is the best news." She had been anxious about how he would react, worried that a baby might be a burden they could not afford or a complication he did not want. But his joy was genuine and absolute, and her own happiness rose to meet it. They were going to be parents. They were going to build a family. The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide was sick for months, and the physical demands of ranch work became increasingly difficult as her belly grew. But Thomas was endlessly patient and supportive, taking on extra chores without complaint and making sure she rested. He treated her like she was made of glass, which annoyed her sometimes, but she knew it came from love and concern. As winter deepened and turned toward spring, they prepared for the baby's arrival. Adelaide sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Thomas built a cradle from smooth pine, carving horses into the headboard with loving detail. They talked about names and wondered whether it would be a boy or a girl and made plans for a future that now seemed bright with possibility. The baby came on a warm June night in 1879, just over a year since Adelaide and Thomas had married. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the doctor from Durango and two experienced women from neighboring ranches. Thomas paced outside for hours, unable to sit still, until finally, just before dawn, he heard the thin wail of a newborn and nearly collapsed with relief. Adelaide was exhausted and pale but smiling when he was allowed into the bedroom. She held a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had sewn, and when Thomas approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal a small red face and a shock of dark hair. "It is a boy," she said softly. "We have a son." Thomas looked down at his child, at the impossibly tiny fingers and the scrunched-up face, and felt his heart crack open with love so fierce it was almost painful. "He is perfect," he managed, his voice rough. "You are perfect. Thank you, Adelaide." They named him Daniel Thomas Keller, and he became the center of their world. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the baby despite his rough hands and cowboy ways. Adelaide recovered slowly from the birth, but she was happy in a deep foundational way that had nothing to do with momentary pleasure and everything to do with rightness and completion. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. They expanded their herd and built a second, smaller barn for hay storage. The store in town maintained steady business, providing reliable supplemental income. Thomas's reputation as a horse trainer spread, and he began getting clients from outside Durango who would pay premium prices for his work. Adelaide managed all the business aspects with skill and careful planning, ensuring they had savings for emergencies and could reinvest in improvements. Daniel grew from a tiny infant into a robust toddler, curious and fearless and utterly adored. He learned to walk holding onto his father's hands, taking wobbly steps across the porch while Adelaide watched and laughed. He developed Thomas's coloring and Adelaide's stubborn determination, and he was fascinated by the horses, spending hours watching his father work with them. On a summer evening when Daniel was 2 years old, Adelaide stood on the porch watching her son play in the yard while Thomas mended a saddle nearby. The sun was setting over the mountains in a glory of gold and crimson, and the air smelled of sage and earth and growing things. She thought about the terrified, grieving young woman she had been 3 years ago, standing in a store that was about to be taken from her, believing that everything was lost. She whispered that everything was lost now, those words echoing from the past, from the darkest moment of her life. Thomas looked up from his work as though he had heard, though she had not spoken aloud. He stood and came to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Together they watched their son and the sunset and the land they had built together. "Then we will build something new," Thomas said quietly, the echo of his promise from that first conversation, and Adelaide leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart. "We did," she said. "We built something wonderful." Life continued its steady rhythm through the years that followed. The ranch became known as one of the best in the region, prosperous without being ostentatious, a testament to hard work and careful management. Daniel grew tall and strong, learning ranching from his father and business sense from his mother, a boy who was equally comfortable on horseback or working through a ledger. When Daniel was 5, Adelaide gave birth to a second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Adelaide's mother. Where Daniel was bold and adventurous, Sarah was thoughtful and gentle, but she had an iron will that rivaled her mother's. Thomas doted on his daughter with unabashed favoritism, though he would never admit it, and Adelaide watched her husband teach their little girl to ride with patience and pride. The family that grew on that ranch north of Durango was loud and loving, full of laughter and occasional arguments, and the deep contentment that comes from people who genuinely like each other. Thomas and Adelaide never lost the partnership that had been the foundation of their marriage, working side by side through challenges and triumphs. But they had also built romance and passion, and a love that deepened with every passing year. Adelaide sometimes thought about the proposal Thomas had made, the offer of a business arrangement and a chance to build something new. She thought about her fear and desperation, about the leap of faith it had taken to marry a near stranger. She thought about how impossibly young and naive she had been, despite her grief and loss. But mostly she thought about how grateful she was that Thomas Keller had walked into her father's store on that spring morning in 1878, and had seen in her not just a woman in trouble but a potential partner, someone strong enough to build a life with. He had offered her a chance when she had believed all chances were gone, and together they had created something that neither could have achieved alone. The ranch prospered through the years, weathering droughts and harsh winters and the inevitable challenges that came with working the land. Daniel eventually married a schoolteacher from Durango, a smart young woman named Emily who fit seamlessly into the family. Sarah showed a talent for breeding horses that surpassed even her father's, developing a reputation that brought clients from across Colorado and beyond. Thomas's hair went gray at the temples, and Adelaide developed lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun, but they grew older together with grace and humor. They added rooms onto the house as the family expanded, eventually building a separate cabin for Daniel and Emily and their children. The ranch became a compound of sorts, multiple generations living and working together, building on the foundation that Thomas and Adelaide had established. On their 20th anniversary, Thomas took Adelaide up into the mountains for a picnic, just the two of them. It was a rare luxury to leave the ranch for a full day, but their children and grandchildren assured them they could manage without supervision for once. They rode to a high meadow Thomas had discovered years ago, a hidden place with a view that stretched for miles. They ate lunch sitting on a blanket, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the way of people who had spent 2 decades learning each other. When the food was gone, Adelaide lay back on the blanket and looked up at the impossibly blue sky. Thomas stretched out beside her. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "When you came into the store for supplies?" "Of course I remember. I thought you were the saddest and strongest woman I had ever seen. I wanted to help you, but I did not know how. Took me 3 days to work up the nerve to propose that insane business arrangement." Adelaide laughed. "It was insane. I should have said no. Any sensible person would have said no. But you were not just sensible, you were brave." Thomas rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "You took a chance on me when you had every reason to be afraid. You trusted me with your future. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do." "I did not feel brave. I felt desperate and terrified, and like I was leaping off a cliff with no idea if there was water below or just rocks." Adelaide reached up to touch his face, tracing the familiar lines and planes. But you caught me. You have been catching me for 20 years. We caught each other, Thomas said. That is how partnership works. He kissed her there in the high meadow with the mountains watching, and Adelaide kissed him back, tasting sun and time and enduring love. She thought about everything they had built together, the ranch and the family and the life that had grown from that desperate business proposal so many years ago. She thought about the girl she had been, grieving and alone, believing that everything was lost. She had been wrong. Everything had not been lost. Some things had been lost, her parents and her childhood and certain naive dreams about how life would unfold. But in losing those things, she had found others that were more precious because they were real and earned and built with her own hands. She had found purpose and partnership, and a love that had transformed her in ways she could never have imagined. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, and eventually they packed up their picnic and rode back down the mountain toward home. The ranch spread out below them, the buildings and corrals and fields that represented years of work and sacrifice and triumph. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and Adelaide could see small figures moving in the yard, her grandchildren playing while the adults worked nearby. This was what they had built, she and Thomas, from ashes and grief and a pragmatic proposal. This was the something new that had risen from the ruins of everything lost. It was not perfect, because nothing in life was perfect. There had been struggles and sorrows mixed with the joys. But it was theirs, built together, and it was good and true and worth every moment of fear and faith it had taken to create. As they rode into the yard, Daniel and Sarah emerged from the barn, and the grandchildren came running to greet them. Thomas dismounted and lifted Adelaide down from her horse, his hands strong and sure after all these years. She stood in the circle of his arms for a moment, surrounded by the noise and love of their family, and felt complete. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Adelaide and Thomas sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The stars were brilliant in the dark Colorado sky, and the mountains were black silhouettes against the horizon. They sat close together, Thomas's arm around Adelaide's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked quietly. "Everything," Adelaide said. "How strange life is, how we never know what is coming, how sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things." "Do you have any regrets?" Adelaide considered the question seriously, as she always did when Thomas asked something important. "I regret that my parents did not get to see what we built. I regret that they did not get to know their grandchildren. I regret the pain and fear of those days after my father died. But I do not regret a single choice I made after that. I do not regret marrying you or coming to this ranch or building this life. How could I regret any of it when it brought me here to this moment?" Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Adelaide. I have loved you for 20 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "You saved me," Adelaide said softly. "When everything was lost, you offered me a future. You gave me a chance to build something new." "We saved each other," Thomas corrected. "And we built something new together. That is the only way it works, Adelaide. Together." She knew he was right. The story she had been telling herself for years about the desperate young woman rescued by the kind cowboy was not quite accurate. Yes, Thomas had offered her a lifeline when she was drowning, but she had offered him something too, partnership and purpose and eventually love. They had not been rescuer and rescued. They had been two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who recognized in each other the potential for something greater than either could achieve alone. The years continued to pass with the relentless steadiness of seasons. Thomas's joints grew stiff in winter, and Adelaide needed spectacles for close work. Their children took over more of the daily ranch operations, though Thomas could never quite give up training horses, and Adelaide still kept meticulous financial records. They became the family elders, dispensing advice and settling disputes, and delighting in a growing collection of grandchildren. On a spring morning much like the one when they had first met, Adelaide was working in the garden behind the house when Thomas came to find her. He moved more slowly now, his cowboy's grace tempered by time, but he still made her heart skip when he smiled. "Come sit with me," he said, offering his hand. "The work can wait." They sat on the porch together, looking out at the ranch that had been their shared endeavor for more than 30 years. Everything was green and growing, full of promise and life. The grandchildren's laughter drifted from the barn where Daniel was teaching the oldest boy to mend tack. "We did good," Thomas said, his weathered hand finding Adelaide's. "We did better than good," Adelaide replied. "We did magnificently." And she meant it. This life, built from loss and pragmatism and an insane leap of faith, had become something beautiful and enduring. She had whispered that everything was lost, standing in the ruins of her old life. Thomas had said they would build something new, and they had, day by day, choice by choice together. They had built a ranch, and a family, and a love story that would endure long after they were gone, written into the land itself, and the memories of their children, and the continuing legacy of partnership and courage. As the sun climbed higher in the Colorado sky, Adelaide Keller sat beside her husband and felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived, a chance well taken, and a love well earned. Everything had been lost once, long ago. But everything that truly mattered had been found, built, and treasured in the years since. And that, she thought, was the greatest triumph of all.